All right. Good morning, everyone. I've got my cup of tea here, and I was wondering if anyone knew how Moses makes his tea. He brews it, of course. Hebrews. You've likely heard that one from a certain comedian at the Orleans campus, because I know I've heard him say it. I'm covering Exodus 1 and 2 today. I was tempted to tell you to go and watch the replay of Pastor Rhonda's message from Sunday and then just wipe my hands of all of this, but I didn't want to leave Pastor Julie hanging. The primary sources I used to prepare this morning was a reading plan in the YouVersion app by Newbridge Poon, called In the Midst of Uncertainty, and the Enduring Word Commentary by David Guzik. Let's invite God into our teaching time this morning. Father, thank you for your faithfulness. As we read these stories of your faithfulness to the Israelites, help us to grow in our trust that you will be faithful in your promises to us too. Thank you that even when we endure hardship, you never turn your back on us. You orchestrate everything for our ultimate good. Let your words speak to our hearts. Amen. The book of Exodus is a story of redemption, and yes, God's faithfulness. God delivers the Israelites in a great exodus from their lives as slaves in Egypt to make them his special people. He later provides them with the law, which gives instructions on how they could be consecrated and made holy. It's interesting to note that in the original language, the first word of Exodus is and, showing its continuity from the book of Genesis. Before we dig in here, we can glance back at Genesis 46, 3-4, to a place called Beersheba. God visited with Jacob there, reiterating the promise he made to Abraham. He tells Jacob it will be in Egypt that his family will become a great nation. This is a more positive aspect of the prophecy that God gave Abram back in Genesis 15:13, when God stated, "You can be sure that your descendants will be strangers in a foreign land where they will be oppressed as slaves for 400 years." I wonder if that part of the story was told around campfires at night when they first settled into Egypt. God also reminds Jacob of his mortality, telling him that he will die in Egypt, but his beloved son will be with him. Let's read verses 1-5. I'm using the NLT version this morning. These are the names of the sons of Israel, that is Jacob, who moved to Egypt with their father, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. In all, Jacob had 70 descendants in Egypt, including Joseph, who was already there. If we back up a little, we realize that Jacob's family started back in Haran with 5: Jacob, Rachel, Leah, Zilpah, and Bilhah. Even though they have grown to 70, they're a long ways off from being a great nation. We're told in verse 6, in time, Joseph and all of his brothers died, ending that entire generation. Joseph, the great-grandson of Abraham, had been here a hero in Egypt. He saved the country and the world from a terrible famine. He held a high and honorable office in Egypt because of his wisdom and his gifts in administration. But now Joseph is gone, and the family loses the status they enjoyed because of him. Verse 7 starts with but. But their descendants, the Israelites, had many children and grandchildren. In fact, they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful and filled the land. Now that's more like it, we think. God's promise is unfolding. It's too bad that Jacob is also in the grave and will not witness the development of this great nation of Israel. Remember in Genesis 32:28, God changed Jacob's name to Israel, giving his family and descendants the name Israelites. It's interesting to note here, too, that because of their ancestor Abram, he was known as Abram the Hebrew back in Genesis 14:13. Other nations then often referred to the Israelites as Hebrews, as they do in this story. Let's continue with verse 8. Eventually, a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. He said to his people, "Look, the people of Israel now outnumber us and are stronger than we are. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us. Then they will escape from the country." At the time, the Egyptians feared invasion from the Hittites of the north. If the Hebrews among them joined with the Hittites, it posed a significant threat to their security. With the rise of this new Pharaoh and his fear of losing his power and control, the lives of the Israelites are about to get rough. Verses 11 to 14. So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. They forced them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramesses as supply centers for the king. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, and the more alarmed the Egyptians became. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all the work in the fields. They were ruthless in all their demands. So while the promise of a great nation is beginning to come to pass, the Israelites are now punished for their growth and made into slaves. Did they look around after a long day of abusive labor as they applied warm compresses to their aching backs and wonder, is this it? Is this the promise we waited so long for? God had promised prosperity and blessing, but what they faced was a harsh, oppressive situation. In the midst of it, life must have seemed hopeless to the children of Israel, and the idea that God was working out his plan must have seemed kind of far fetched. As readers, we know that their slavery eventually ends as Moses is used to free God's people. We learn to trust in God's faithfulness because we see that the hardship does not negate his promises. We're also reminded that God's plan might not look like our plan, as Julie was saying. He will unfold his perfect plan in his perfect timing, just like he does in the Israelites' story. So that brings me to reflection question 1. In what ways can you relate to feeling hopeless or questioning God's plan during difficult times? How does the Israelites' story encourage you to hang in there and trust him in the face of adversity? As we read on, we see that Pharaoh amps up his evil plan for this growing nation. Let's continue with verses 15 to 16. Then Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gave this order to the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. When you help the Hebrew women as they give birth, watch as they deliver. If the baby is a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, let her live. I ask that you indulge me here for a little retelling of this story. I wrote a book a few years back called You're a Star, Performing for an Audience of One. The premise of this yet to be published book is that as believers, we are all on a stage. While God is the only audience member that we give the power to direct us, there are a lot of people in that audience who know we are children of God who are watching. The importance of growing to be more like Jesus and reflecting God's glory cannot be stressed enough when we think of how our words and actions can be shining lights for Him in a dark world. A large part of that book focuses on the stories of women in the Bible who exhibit the fruit of the Spirit in their lives. As Pastor Rhonda said on Sunday, they were ordinary women like us. They never knew that they were on a stage like no other, with their stories recorded in the most famous book ever, lasting thousands of years and being shared all over the world. I'm going to read the story I wrote about Puah, one of the midwives, and her shining moment on that big stage. This account is the fictionalized version of verses 15 to 19. Puah's story. "What are you doing?" my partner hissed as I bundled the newborn in a fresh blanket and readied him to meet his mother. "I'm doing my job," I said, giving her a pointed stare. Shiphrah grabbed my sleeve to still me as I stepped toward the woman's bed. "But the king, we have orders. He commanded." I turned my body sharply to release her grip. "Do you agree with this command, Shiphrah? Will you be the one to kill this beautiful, healthy child?" I held the bundle out to her. "Here, how can I help? Would you like a knife? A hammer? How would you like to do this?" Shiphrah's face had lost all color. She shook her head and gestured for me to keep the baby. I smiled into his dark eyes and sang a little tune my mother used to sing to me at bedtime. His eyelids fluttered closed, and I kissed his smooth forehead. I would need more than a king's order to hurt this precious child. When I placed him on his mother's chest, I watched her face light up and split into a tremendous smile. She snuggled him to her breast and said, "Thank you. Your gentle hands and kindness are much appreciated." I nodded and returned the smile, even while catching the dark look on Shiphrah's face across the room. We packed up our things in strained silence. On the walk back to town, however, my partner voiced her concerns again. Pua, how will we explain this? If all the Hebrew babies live, we will be held responsible. We will pay with our heads. I bit my lip. It had been easy to disobey and rebel against the king's order when I had a sweet, innocent child in my arms. I don't know, I admitted. We'll think of something. Shipra frowned, clearly unhappy with my response. Do you know why he wants to kill us, or he wants to kill all the baby boys? I shook my head. I couldn't imagine any reason that would justify murdering babies. It's because he's afraid. Afraid of infants? I exclaimed with a snort. Afraid of us, the Hebrews. We're strong and numerous. The king fears we will rebel against them or join his enemies in battle. She kicked a stone off the path and watched it roll away before continuing. My husband said that the king has ordered his men to be extra hard on our laborers, making them work twice as hard as before. They're whipped or beaten if they take a break or slow down. But after months of abusing them like this, my husband said our men are even bigger and stronger. The great Pharaoh has more cause to be scared. He can't just order the deaths of thousands of men, but he can try and reduce our numbers by killing the male infants, I finished. Yes, exactly. She stopped walking and placed her hand on my arm to stop me too. Her eyes were wide as she asked, What are we going to do, Pua? I took both her hands in mine. Do you know who I fear more than the king, Shifra? She shook her head. God, the God of our father Abraham. His wrath is to be feared above Pharaoh's. I will not purposely harm one of our children. It's much more important to do what is right before God. My words sounded brave, but my heart pounded violently in my chest. Who was I to defy the king of Egypt? A tear slipped down Shifra's face. I'm afraid. How do we choose which sovereignty to obey? What will our punishment be when we're found out? I held her hands more tightly. We must agree to be in this together, you and me. We will pray to our Almighty God every time we disobey and deliver a boy. If we're found out, we'll trust that he will protect us from Pharaoh. Oh, you are much stronger than I, Pua. Tears sprang up in my own eyes then and streamed down, giving away my true feelings. No, dear sister, I am not strong, but I will not harm one of God's special children for anyone, no matter how many titles he wears. I dropped my voice to a whisper. Will you agree to do this with me? She pulled her hands away and hugged me instead. Yes, my friend, we will do this together. If we perish, we'll go down as one. So we continued to deliver babies for our Hebrew sisters as the gentle, loving midwives we were known to be. Whether male or female, all the newborns were presented to their mothers unharmed. We'd never seen so many healthy, strong babies. It was as if we were helping God build an army. I prayed daily for his protection as we defied Pharaoh's orders. We delivered hundreds of Hebrew boys before the fateful day arrived. Shipra and I were called before the king. He did not hide his anger, roaring his accusation when he saw us. Why have you done this thing and preserved the male children's lives? I wiped my sweaty palms on my dress and glanced at Shipra. Her eyes were closed and her lip firmly clenched between her teeth. My partner in crime was not going to be of any benefit. Well, the king was not impressed with our delay in responding. My heart raced as I opened my mouth to speak, not knowing what I could do or say to save our lives. Suddenly, my lips moved, forming words that my mind wasn't creating. Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, my lord. My voice sounded strong and confident, even though my hands shook and sweat dripped down my back. He frowned. How so? Shipra was also staring at me, waiting to hear this magnificent observation. I prayed that God would continue speaking through me because this was clearly what was happening. Hebrew women are hardy, and their labor is vigorous. Before we arrive to assist in the deliveries, they've already given birth, Your Majesty. The opportunity to intercede as you commanded does not occur. I kept my eyes down and knitted my fingers together to stop them from trembling. He did not speak for a minute. I could feel his glare on my skin. Then he spoke to Shifra. Is this so? Does this one declare the truth? I watched my friend clench her jaw. Oh, please, God, make her confirm my story. Yes, sir, it is true. We have never seen stronger mothers than these. Her voice was whispery, and I barely heard her life-saving words. Pharaoh leaned forward and squinted his eyes. Every child? Every child is born before you get there. Not every child, I answered, feeling Shifra's terrified gaze on my lips. All the male babies, Your Majesty. It's as if do not talk to me about their God, Pharaoh roared. The order stands. If you are present for the birth of a male Hebrew child, you are to cast it into the river without delay. The king has spoken, and I will not be defied. If I discover you have lied to me, you will die because of your disobedience. He raised his arm and pointed toward the door. Go, he commanded. When we got outside the castle gates, Shipra threw herself into my arms. I can't believe you lied to the king, she whispered. I was so scared. My legs suddenly grew weak, and I stumbled against her. She propped me up with a strength I didn't know she had. Are you okay, Pua? No, I admitted. I was frightened too. I didn't know what to say until the words poured out of me. The God of our father saved us. She touched my face. But you're so pale. Are you sure there's not something more? I smiled then, ready to share my secret. I'm with child, Shifra. God willing, I will soon have a family after all these years of helping other women bring their babies into the world. My partner squealed and jumped with delight. Oh, Pooh, I'm so happy for you. You'll never believe that I have good news too. My flow stopped 3 months ago. My child will grow up to play with yours. My smile was so big it hurt my face. We joined hands and danced in a circle. Our God is faithful, and he blesses those who fear him. We would continue to honor him instead of Pharaoh. God be praised. When we pick up the real story in Exodus 1 and 20, we see the possibility that the two midwives might have indeed been with child. So God was good to the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. The midwives were rewarded for their fear of God, putting his will above their own safety. They trusted that God was bigger, stronger, and more fearsome than Pharaoh, and they chose God. It was through this decision that Moses, one of the greatest leaders of Israel, was not murdered at birth, as the king commanded, but ended up being raised by his daughter in his own castle. That's irony. Let's finish the chapter with verse 22 and read that story, the story of Moses, in Exodus 2. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile River, but you may let the girls live. The birth of Moses. About this time, a man and a woman from the tribe of Levi got married. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that he was a special baby, and she kept him hidden for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. The baby's sister then stood at a distance, watching to see what would happen to him. Side note here: Moses' mother did not disobey Pharaoh. She threw her baby boy in the river as directed. But she made him a little boat first, with materials that were also used in the building of Noah's Ark. Then she sent Moses' older sister to babysit. As Pastor Rhonda pointed out on Sunday, what happens next shows how God orchestrates things with perfect timing. Verses 5 to 10. Soon Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river, and her attendants walked along the riverbank. When the princess saw the basket among the reeds, she sent her maid to go get it for her. When the princess opened it, she saw the baby. The little boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This must be one of the Hebrew children, she said. Then the baby's sister approached the princess. Should I go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? She asked. Yes, do, the princess replied. So the girl went and called the baby's mother. Take this baby and nurse him for me, the princess told the baby's mother. I will pay you for your help. So the woman took her baby home and nursed him. Later, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses, for she explained, I lifted him out of the water. God's protection of Moses showcases his intricate care for his people. He orchestrated the events and timing so that Moses' life would be preserved during that attempted genocide of baby boys. He skillfully guided the parents of Moses, the currents of the Nile, and the heart of Pharaoh's daughter to further his plan and purpose. As we navigate challenges, it may seem sometimes that God is far away, maybe dealing with something more important. But we see here that God actively works behind the scenes in the most dire situations. His watchful eye and guiding hand arrange all the pieces for our protection and ultimate good. Reflection question 2. When you feel threatened or face hardships, what would it look like to respond in a godly manner? Before we move on, it's important to note that Pharaoh's plan to reduce the Hebrew population failed. The more Egyptians afflicted them, the more the Israelites multiplied and grew. This was God's purpose for their time in Egypt. Egypt served as a mother's womb for Israel, a place where they rapidly grew from a large clan to a mighty nation. This nation couldn't have grown this way in Canaan because it was practically impossible to avoid the intermarriage with the pagan and wicked inhabitants of Canaan. Egypt was so racially biased and had such an entrenched system of racial separation that Israel could grow there over several centuries without being assimilated. The bloodline would remain pure. Let's continue with verses 11 and 12. Moses escapes to Midian. Many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. Acts 7 and 23 tells us that this happened when Moses was 40 years old. Up until then, he was being trained and groomed to become the next Pharaoh of Egypt. Acts 7:22 says that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. While Moses grew up in Pharaoh's house as a prince, he spent his formative years with his own family. His parents, Amram and Jochebed, raised him to know the God of Abraham and to trust him. Moses knew who he was underneath the fancy clothes. He knew whose he was. When he stepped in to save his fellow Hebrew, he might have had noble intentions, but his concern to hide what he did shows a troubled conscience. Let's continue with 13 to 15. The next day, when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw two Hebrew men fighting. "Why are you beating up your friend?" Moses said to the one who had started the fight. The man replied, "Who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed that Egyptian yesterday?" Then Moses was afraid, thinking, "Everyone knows what I did." And sure enough, Pharaoh heard what had happened, and he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. Moses had reason to believe that his education, royal background, success, and great sympathy for the people of Israel would give him credibility among them. He would make the perfect prince and judge for Israel. But they did not want him. Moses had to run for his life from an adoptive grandfather who had no problem killing infants, but somehow saw this crime unforgivable. Moses probably felt that he had messed everything up big time. He likely believed that his chance of delivering God's people was now over, and there was nothing he could do. At this point, Moses was right where God wanted him, humbled. Just like Jesus, Moses had to come down off his throne, away from the palace, and into a humble place before he could deliver his people. And God took 40 more years to prepare Moses' heart for what was to come. We'll pick it up at the end of verse 15 and go to 17. When Moses arrived in Midian, he sat down beside a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters who came as usual to draw water and fill the water troughs for their father's flocks. But some other shepherds came and chased them away. So Moses jumped up and rescued the girls from the shepherds. Then he drew water for their flocks. As a member of the royal family, Moses had been waited on hand and foot. This was his first opportunity to serve others, his first step towards growing in humility. Verses 18 to 22. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked, "Why are you back so soon today?" "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds," they answered, "and then he drew water for us and watered our flocks." "Then where is he?" their father asked. "Why did you leave him there? Invite him to come and eat with us." Moses accepted the invitation and he settled there with him. In time, Reuel gave Moses his daughter Zipporah to be his wife. Later, she gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, for he explained, "I have been a foreigner in a foreign land." By taking a wife and having a son, Moses seemed to have given up on Egypt and his hope of being a deliverer of Israel. He was content with where God had put him. But even in his contentedness, God was training and shaping him for his future calling. Moses had to learn to be a nobody before God could use him. Let's finish from verse 23. Years passed and the king of Egypt died, but the Israelites continued to groan under their burden of slavery. They cried out for help, and their cry rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He looked down on the people of Israel, and he knew it was time to act. God did not turn his attention to Israel because they were such good people, but because of the covenant that he had made with them. He gives his love and attention to us on the same basis, the covenant relationship we have with God through Jesus. Reflection question number 3. Moses had to grow in humility before God allowed him to be a great leader. Can you recall happenings in your life that made you more humble? With that, I see that it is 6:28. I really did speed through that this morning, and I'll pass the mic back to Pastor Julie.